Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and we've got a very exciting guest with us today. We've got Robert Malengreau. Robert is the founder and director of Rio, which is One Rio, based out of Brazil, and he's going to share with us some great insight about the work that they're doing in the Rio community. And Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Roy. Thanks a lot for having me.
We're excited that you were able to join us today, and I'm sure you're having better weather than what we have here in Chicago. But before we dive into the work you're doing down in Rio, I kind of want to get a little bit of your background and hear about what got you interested in this type of work. So take us back to your childhood and what got you interested in sports and where you were growing up.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, I'm born from a Brazilian mother and a British father. I was born and raised in the UK in London. From the age of 6, I played rugby. I started off at London Welsh, which is a rugby team near Richmond. I've always been interested in public policy and politics and how to address issues around social inequality and poverty reduction. From a very young age, I've been very interested in that. And when I studied, after completing an undergraduate course at the University of London at Royal Holloway, I went on to apply for a master's degree at Oxford, where I got accepted. And on a personal level, that acceptance was quite powerful for me on a personal level. I had to overcome quite a lot of early learning difficulties, which led me to struggle a lot at school and led to quite a bit of bullying and low self-esteem. And when I got into a university like Oxford, it was just a feeling of led to a feeling of confidence that and empowerment that on a personal level, whether that's sort of misplaced or not, that I just felt that that feeling is something that I'd love to democratize and make accessible to kids that that might not have as much access to or as many opportunities for educational attainment as I had in my privileged background. So as a keen rugby player, I was invited to pre-season Oxford University Rugby Football Club. By the time I got into Oxford, having spent a year in Rio, where I was sitting in a doctorate course, I became very interested in public policy in Rio's favelas and how public policy could affect social, state, and economic inclusion in Rio's favelas. And yeah, when I got into Oxford, I got invited for pre-season Oxford University Rugby Club, and it just started to dawn on me that maybe with the social inclusion and getting people to interact in different environments is probably one of the hardest things to do. People who might traditionally not be interacting with one another, and if we could potentially try and leverage that brand to bring services and bring and bridge a quite rigid social divide that happens in Brazil and in places like Rio de Janeiro, between favelas and non-favela communities, and we thought about how we could try and use the sport and leverage the sport as an equalizer in that respect. So yeah.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there, and you talk about using sport as an equalizer, and you talk about the socioeconomic differences in Brazil with the favelas and everything that goes on down there. I think it's really challenging as you're trying to deal with such a vast distinctions in terms of what goes on in the community. Talk about that when you first came down to Brazil. How did that process happen in terms of what drew you down there and what your experiences were when you first got integrated into the community?
So, having a Brazilian mother, I came to Brazil quite a lot from a very young age, and Brazil is a country that is almost as famous for its inequalities as it is for its football, and that was quite apparent even from a very young age, where you see the stark contrast of a very concentrated, very concentrated wealth at the top and a vast levels of poverty at the around the country. So fast forwarding to 2013 or 2011, sorry, when I became interested in the role of in favelas and the role of public policy and promoting inclusion in these communities. It was quite clear to me that football and sport plays an important role in the lives of so many low-income communities around the world. It's often seen as a lifeline to escape poverty for so many low-income communities. And it's often seen as the only lifeline, professional sport. So we thought that, we had it with rugby, which was the sport we were using. There was a unique opportunity with the Olympics around the corner in 2016 to use a quite unheard of sport in Brazil to create a sporting culture from scratch that's based on the fundamental values of the sport, and that doesn't come with the baggage that rugby might have in the UK or elsewhere. So yeah, we when we launched in Rio in 2013 in Morro do Castro, a favela in São Gonçalo, just across Rio's Guanabara Bay, it was seen with some level of curiosity as to why are we using an oval ball as opposed to a round ball, and that curiosity enabled us to attach values and aspirations even to a sport that was unheard of. So, in Brazil, you don't become a rugby player and you're not set for life. After becoming a rugby player, you become a rugby player and you're part of a community. You're part of a small, tight-knit community, and in a sport where in a country where the sport is growing. So you have an opportunity there to attach other things to it. And then it's, I think, by no coincidence that through connecting rugby to the Oxbridge brands, for instance, and through not taking a sports evangelist approach of just focusing on rugby, but also offering educational interventions, which I'm sure we'll get to, that when we ask kids nowadays, what does rugby mean to them, they say education. So, that's almost synonymous. So yeah, that was more or less, I'm not sure if I answered your question there, Roy, I'm sorry. I didn't.
I think you covered a lot of ground. I think I want to back up. You talked about rugby doesn't have the baggage in Brazil that it does in the UK. Are you telling me that there's some bad reputations around rugby in the UK?
No, I think in the UK, especially in England, the rugby is very much associated to elitism, private schools. It's starting to change now, and there's been some incredible strides in relation to that, but it's still very much associated to a particular social group. It's also, I think in some respects associated to a very masculinized culture, and when we're applying rugby in a country like Brazil, which is has a sort of cultural framework that very much a very macho cultural framework, but you've got the women's team that is infinitely more successful than the men's team in Brazil. and are actually sort of Latin American champions on a number, South American champions on a number of occasions. You also there have an opportunity to break that mold. And yeah, so I think in the UK, yeah, there in England in particular, there is an association with rugby in private schools, and there is a level of inequality in that respect.
It's interesting when we see how certain sports get defined that way, and people have that opportunity. And you talk about the work that you're doing down in Brazil, and now you've been able to strengthen that to become, as you said, rugby means education. So that's quite a remarkable turnaround when you think about the short amount of time you've been there, over a window of about 7 years, that you've been able to ingrain the values of education to be synonymous with the sport.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's in no part, it would be wrong as well not to mention the incredible support we've had from the local school. There's Morro do Castro. It's worth sort of putting a bit of context in terms of the favela that we operate in. It's there's over 1,000 favelas in sort of Greater Rio, and we were quite passionate about going to a community that had very limited resources. And in the community we operate in, Morro do Castro, at the moment, our recent data indicates that 79% of people live under the poverty line. But there are very limited services, and that's reflected in, again, our recent data indicating that 77% of people say they don't have easy access to healthcare. So we were able to identify the community through support of the local city council, who put us in touch with the local school, who were fully embracing of this, of at the time probably a mad gringo and myself, trying to play rugby in a community that would traditionally not really, wouldn't know what rugby is. So that being associated with the school, the local school, has been, the cornerstone to a lot of our success, and being able to share our learnings and sort of operate using some of the school's infrastructure, and having the support of the school to help, refer kids who might be in particularly vulnerable circumstances. It's been, that association with the school has really been key, and I'm sure contributes to that association between that, alongside the Oxbridge brand, and the fact that we offer, most of our offering is actually educational services now, in spite of the fact that we started off exclusively through rugby. That has contributed to this sporting culture that has become synonymous with educational attainment.
Well, what's interesting to me is you've gone through that transition. You talked about starting with rugby, but you mentioned at the beginning, when you went down there, and your interest in the favelas. I think one of the things that hits me is how many people don't really know or understand much about what those are, what they consist of. So why don't you take a few minutes and kind of give us some of the background? I think many people have heard a little bit about them, or understand that they may not be desirable places, but really don't understand how they came to be, or what the context is for the favelas. You mentioned 1,000 in Greater Rio. And so I think it's important for people to understand that context, because it really relates to the work that you're doing and why you undertook this work.
Yeah. Well, favelas, I could go into sort of the history of favelas, but I mean, the first ever favela was founded in the 19th century. A favela is almost synonymous to a slum, and sort of takes the same sort of chronological development as slums have around the developing world. So you'll start, in the when there was this huge urbanization, where opportunities for employment and so on became centralized around urban centers like Rio, Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, and so on. You start to see a lot of migration coming in from more rural areas. That was more or less around the 50s and 60s, and that there led to an exponential growth of the favelas, these slum areas. Now, in the 1980s, that growth started. People from the northeast of Brazil, which is quite famously some of the poorest areas of the country, were starting to migrate as well to these urban centers, and that coincided with the cocaine boom, which led to drug trafficking, and suddenly you had the growth of informal housing, which is the case of favelas and slums around the developing world, but also a rise in drug trade and crime and violence. So in the context of Morro do Castro, it's a community of around 8,000 people. As I mentioned, we know that about 79% of those are living below the World Bank's extreme poverty line. We know that there's limited access to services. There are huge social barriers that split the community into what has often been described as a divided city, not just in Morro do Castro, but in Rio and actually Brazil in general. You have this concept of a divided city of favela and non-favela. But in my master's research, what I studied was actually it's not a divided city. Like Rio is not a city of favelas and non-favelas. It's actually an asymmetrical city where access to services, levels of violence, income, human development scores, they're all asymmetrically distributed across the city. So those beachside favelas in Rio will tend to have higher levels of higher income levels, while the income inequality between favela residents in those areas and non-favela residents in those areas will be greater. Those residents will tend to have greater access to services, and they'll have lower levels of crime because the state will invest more in those communities and servicing those communities. And in the meantime, you have 98% of the favelas that are around the city that are even more, I mean, it's worth mentioning when I say that they're better serviced, they're not well serviced. But they're better serviced. But you then have these 98% of the favelas that will tend to have little to no state service except a incredibly brutal police force. And in fact, in the case of the Morro do Castro favela that we operate in, we have the most lethal police battalion in the entire greater Rio area operating in that community. So as part of that Morro do Castro is part of that battalion's jurisdiction. So I'm not sure I can waffle on, Roy, as you know. So
well, it sounds like very difficult conditions in which to operate and in which to expand a program when you're dealing with those kinds of challenges, from the poverty to the lack of service to the brutality of the police forces. You really are facing a number of obstacles that go far and above what people typically think of when they look at how do you launch a sports program,
yeah,
and how do you pull something together to be able to work with kids, because just the opportunity to engage with kids is a huge accomplishment to get over all of those barriers. So how did you break in at the beginning when you talk about this? That's got to be very hard to get over
Yes.
all of those challenges.
Yeah, I think it's again like the cornerstone for that entry is to establishing strong partnerships with community-based organizations. And we were very fortunate to establish this partnership with the local school. So, you know, which is a school that has been operating there for 43 years, has gained the trust of parents and children, and by through embracing us, the students became, you know, more intrigued by this new sport. You know, you start off with 10 students, and you end up with, you know, 400 children that we serve usually on an annual basis through our different services, and that's through building confidence. And I think that, you know, having that platform through the school was very much, you know, was very, very important. I think in terms of sort of gaining the interest and intrigue of students, it's quite well documented as well that contact sports tend to distance individuals from risky behaviors. So, you know, we're not going to be attracting a student who might be more prone, or, you know, might be more vulnerable to certain risky behaviors like entry to the drug trade, or school dropouts, or other forms of risky behaviors. We're not going to attract them through an English course. We're equally not going to necessarily attract them through a non-contact sport. And if you're bringing a brand new sport, it's, you know, having that contact aspect to it definitely generated interest, and offers, you know, a valve for a lot of children who go through so many levels of challenges. So yeah, I think it was a sort of gaining that entry was a combination um, of those two things. You know, having a very interesting sport that would sort of meet the needs of and interests of children who might be more vulnerable to risky behaviors, but also establishing solid relationships and building trust within the community through community-based partners was definitely very much at the center of that.
It's interesting because as you describe those risky behaviors, those may look different in Rio than they look in Chicago or New York or Miami or in other parts of the world. But one of the universal things that you talked about is how sports can break down those barriers and keep kids away from negative influences, whether it's gangs, drugs, violence, all types of other aspects that become risky because they have something uh, to look forward to, right? Something that they're excited about participating in, as you said, and I'll be the first one to say, right? If you told me to come and participate in an English class, yeah, that's not going to interest me very much. But if you gave me an opportunity to play, you know, football, soccer, rugby, whatever that case may be, that's something that's going to be more attractive, and that might be enough to make me not want to lose the rights or the opportunities to play by getting involved with some of those risky behaviors you're describing. But I imagine that that's a really difficult shift culturally as you go in to start building the partnerships in the favelas to find groups that have enough strength, I guess I'll call it, internally there to be able to carve out the space for you to operate this type of program.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, you know, you're talking about sort of the risks of vulnerabilities to risky behaviors. I thought I'd sort of just touch on that some of the main drivers of gang involvement. A recent study found that 66% of kids joined the gangs because of a desire to support their families. And an earlier research found that it was alienation from education and employment. 44% joined because of that. 23% joined for financial struggles, and 12% joined because of a desire for a greater sense of belonging. So none of those drivers really, when people talk about solutions to sort of some of the public security challenges, for instance, often the first point of call is to sort of have more, often people call for draconian policing strategies and more ruthless policing. But none of those drivers really indicate that. What they indicate is an integrated and holistic approach that touches on a number of different issues that can be offered with an approach that uses things like rugby or sport to provide that sense of belonging, but that also works to address sort of financial struggles and provide an education and actually care about the type of education that these type of forms of learning. As someone who myself had early learning difficulties, I know that there are different ways that you can that people learn. I'm heavily dyslexic. I know that you give me a book to read, I'm going to find it really difficult to give you a summary of it. But if there are different methods to be used to teach, and so it's about like knowing that context, working with partners that can relate to your understanding of what the challenge is, and we were very lucky in the case of the João Brasil School to have that, and then working really closely with those schools to make sure that your methodology and your model is in line with the local need. I think that, when in terms of building that trust, you mentioned one of the first, building the trust of the school in itself was a task in itself, as you mentioned. The head teacher, who's now is a good friend, often said, for the first 3 years, I was expecting you to just leave at any moment, because you have so many social projects that pop up in an opportune time, like prior to the Olympics, or which was our case, and that sort of bring a brand, and then within a few weeks they've gone, and that's in low-income communities, especially in the developing world. These kids are so used to it. I remember when we launched, and we had our first group of volunteers who came out, when we were sort of finalizing that volunteer program, some of the kids were crying and saying, look, we know you guys will just not come back. And thankfully, 7 years later, we're still there. So yeah, it is a process about sort of developing trust. It's not a straightforward process. And within that context, you need to know the environment. And we were very lucky to have an organization in the school which has 43 years of experience knowing all the different challenges that these kids face, that know what to do in the case of a gun battle, can support us through those initial phases, which at the beginning was quite daunting from an outsider's perspective, but with the right support, you get through it.
Yeah, you've raised some really interesting points and all the support that you get, and I can't imagine trying to, as you said, fight through a gun battle and without having that support on your side. But there's a lot of moving parts to what you're describing, and so there must be some significant costs and expenses to trying to put together and run a program like this. So how is Umrio funded to be able to provide all of these services?
Well, we started off in 2013, as many organizations and social projects might. I think Social projects, will often be instinctive in their nature and react to a social challenge, and will, be driven by that, exclusively by that passion to get something done. As you grow from an organization which at the beginning was offering 2 hours of rugby a week to an organization that now, is offering at times over 60 hours of activities across 4 pillars around rugby, education, employability, and healthcare.
Go through those again one more time. Rugby, education.
Rugby, education, employability, and healthcare. So we use those 4 pillars to address those multifaceted challenges that the children and young people we work with face. We started off with, at the very start, trying to do very low-level grassroots fundraising to get some rugby boots for the kids, and we were very fortunate to be able to do that at the time. And as we grew, and as the program was clearly working, we were lucky to get a lot of achieve some grant-based funding, and that's been very much the core of our funding streams. Now, in fact, one of our major supporters is, we have one very, we have a major supporter who's actually Chicago-based, coincidentally, but we're also supported by Laureus. We're also supported by Beyond Sport. We're supported by a family foundation in Holland, and so we've been able to achieve quite a bit of get quite a few grants that would help run our operations. We've had the support of Kieran Bracken, for instance, who's a World Cup winning rugby player in 2003, who's been doing some fundraising for us. But yeah, that's the basis of our, what keeps us going at this stage. And actually in 2020, which was obviously a very difficult year for everyone, we were really taken aback by the level of individual donations we've been getting in order to keep our food security program, which at the time, it was part of our crisis strategy, in which we ran between March and December. And offered over 17 tons of food to 80 families, the equivalent of, I think, about 38,000 meals. So yeah, that was funded with a combination of the flexible grant-based funding, but also a lot of individual donations, which really, we were really, really sort of moved by. Not sure if I answered your question again, Roy. I'm sorry.
No, it's great to see that you've been able to build up that base of support. I know it's very challenging to do that, and you've been able to clearly demonstrate to those caliber of organizations that the work you're doing is having a great impact in the community. So I want to congratulate you on doing that. It's such important work, and something that people often don't see from the outside, or don't understand exactly how that impacts what goes on there. So as you look back at the time that you've been working in Rio, you have to pick out 1 or 2 things. What do you think are your biggest accomplishments that you're most proud of over that course of time?
I think, in spite of 2020 being, by far one of the most challenging years, and I think most people's lives up until now, our capacity to adapt that 4-pillar model to respond to those needs and have a very robust monitoring evaluation framework, which allowed us to understand better the individual needs of our beneficiaries. We were able to really, I mean, I'm incredibly proud of what, as a team, we achieved. When I say a team, I mean from supporters, from funders to the students themselves. Like we were able to take half of those living in extreme poverty out of extreme poverty through a multifaceted crisis strategy, which included scholarships, which included food security packages, internet packages, psychological support. We reduced the number of people living on a dollar a day from 106 to 11 through this targeted needs-based approach. And when I saw that, I'm not just saying that I'm proud of the kids, for any other reason. I'm saying that while we weren't able to play rugby, we were able to apply rugby, and that's something that the kids said. And I think one of the most moving moments in my entire time at Rio was when it's actually two events. In 2019, one of our board members came to do his master's research on the role of rugby on educational attainment and self-efficacy here at Rio. He interviewed one of the kids and said, what does rugby mean to you? And the kid said, family, I bleed for my team. Fast forward to 2020, and bearing in mind that 79% of those kids that we work with were living in extreme poverty, we started to run out of funds to be able to deliver our food security program at the scale that it was by the end. So we asked young people, our beneficiaries, are you in a position to be able to give your care package to someone who might need it more? And I think half of all those who respond, or half of beneficiaries said that they would be able to, bearing in mind that 79% are in extreme poverty, with many of whom were living on less than $1 a day. And in fact, one student in particular who mentioned that was on 49 cents a day and said they donate their care package. And it just it rung in my ear, the I bleed for my team. And in fact, when you talk about the role of sport and it's more than a hashtag, this feeling of camaraderie and teamwork, because the fact that from those who said that they would donate their care package, 80% were rugby players from the program, because we have deliver different services, but the majority were rugby players, the vast majority. In terms of helping deliver those care packages, again, vast majority rugby players. So when I look at our achievements and I reflect on I think an organization's capacity to respond to that level of crisis is probably the proudest I've been of what we've achieved. At every level at Rio, from funders to board to staff to students, it's just, and to partners. That is really, I think it really showed sport at its best.
Well, you've really hit on some key points there where you talk about that team and that camaraderie of people looking out for each other, right? So even the person who doesn't have a lot recognizes that there are still people who have less than I do. Even though I might be living on 49 cents a day, as you said, there's somebody who's living on 24 cents a day or less. And so the ability for people to realize that, and I think that's the beauty of the program that you've created, which is people lifting each other up and recognizing the power of giving and the power of helping others and what that does to your confidence and your self-image, because if you're just take, you don't have that same feeling, and you don't have that same connection, and also that same responsibility of what can I do to help other people in this community. This is a very challenging time, and if I can help somebody else, right, in the concept of good karma, I know that if I can pass on my care package, there'll be another opportunity for me to get more and build up those relationships. So Robert, I commend you enormously for the work that you're doing. We look forward to following that. And if people want to get in touch with you and continue to follow the work you're doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can email me directly at robert@umrio.org. So that's robert@umrio.org. So yeah, feel free to email me. I should get back to you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to anybody who's interested in being part. I think the beauty of part of the beauty of 2020 was the fact that we've been able to engage volunteers. I mean, right now there's a class going on that's led by an English class going on that's led by a guy in the UK. So if people have different skills that they would be interested in applying to our model, and we were happy to have a conversation and see what the best fit might be.
Well, again, congratulations. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your outstanding work that you're doing in the community. And to all of our listeners and viewers, we appreciate you taking time to join us on the Sports Philanthropy podcast. This is your host, Roy Kessel, signing off. Please don't forget to live generously.